Shall we go? Wonderful. So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Joseph Osafuedu, the Director for Center for Region Studies. And today I have Professor Silvia Sara Canetto, one of the big minds in suicide and gender issues and culture or cultural issues in suicide. She's worked in various universities, but currently is in Colorado State University, who is visiting Ghana and did us the honors of presenting to us one of the important topics in the area of aging, suicide. Sylvia is a big mind in suicidality, one of the big minds in suicide and gender, suicide and culture. And today we are going to be listening to her. Feel free, as the lecture rules, you can ask questions, you can ask her to break and then try to understand. But if you could allow her to just finish, then we can engage. On that note, thank you very much for making the time. Now, Sylvia, over to you. Yes. Yes.
Testing now.
Okay.
It's working before. Now working? Yes, I can. Yeah, it's working now. Do I need to hold it?
No, I need to tell her.
You need to make this nice. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to Professor Rosato and to Priscilla Onsei-Bos for making it possible for this lecture and event to occur today here. I have a structured lecture, and I will gallop through the question. There's quite a bit of content, and some of it you can visit more slowly by accessing also written material that I'm happy to. I listed at the end of the lecture, and I'm happy also to make available to you if you have a hard time accessing it. My presentation is entitled, as you see there, A Masculinity-Script Perspective on Older Adult Men's Vulnerability to Suicide. For it, I draw on my theoretical and empirical work to challenge the dominant paradigm on older adult male suicide, the dominant paradigms both in terms of theory as well as the prevention of older adult male suicide. I also want to kind of remind you, as you probably can tell from my name, I'm not from the US. I'm an Italian who lives in the US. So I have an accent, and I'm being formed by many different cultural influences, although I've been working in the United States for a while, but I went there as an adult. In terms of first set of issues that I will cover are descriptive epidemiology of male suicide as well as construct. In most countries, including the United States, men have higher rates of mortality from suicidal behavior than women, though they have lower rate of non-fatal suicidal behavior. A pattern that I've called the gender paradox of suicide. And this is the article where we first came out with this term and with this particular framework, meaning higher mortality, but lower rates of engagement with suicidality, which is a paradox because usually when you have a higher engagement with life-threatening behavior, you have a high mortality by it. In this case, you see a different path for non-fatal versus fatal. This is an old graph from WHO that shows this pattern just looking at suicide patterns by sex to counter the report to WHO. This data from the United States that give you a little bit more nuances with regard to patterns of suicide by sex and age in the United States, and you see that among older adults, men are overrepresented in this among the suicide relative to women. It's important, however, that if you look at patterns in the United States, just to give you an idea of this, it's important to look at culture, that if you actually track suicide patterns by sex and age and ethnicity, you see a lot more variability, whereby the highest mortality in the United States among older adult men is men of European descent, which is another paradox, in some ways an ethic paradox, and I'll address it a little bit later. In terms of other key points that I want to make is terminology. The terminology that has been dominant in the field when I entered it many years ago is that suicides were completed and successful or attempted and failed. Men succeeded at suicide and women failed at suicide. You can see the irony and the inappropriateness of this particular terminology. So some of the first things that I did in my early publication was to really challenge this language, because I said that calling a suicide completed or successful, implying that killing oneself is a success and a sign of strength and determination, and that surviving is a failure. And I said, actually, this particular language makes it difficult to understand and appreciate how surviving a suicidal act is a more formidable, more courageous, and more successful behavior from the point of view of coping than killing oneself. The language has evolved since the 80s when I started working in the field, and now at least the term completed and successful is mostly exited. Attempted is still there, but you will see me using just the term suicide for fatal suicidal behavior and just non-fatal suicidal behavior for suicidal behavior that is not fatal. I also want to clarify briefly that I use terms sex and gender very distinctly, sex to refer to female and male, and gender to refer to the meanings, the cultural attached to biological difference between female and males and the different social statuses associated with being female and male. So gender is a set of norm-based that are imposed on people on the basis of sex. I'll skip this one. I also now want to bring to the masculinity scripts idea, and I'm borrowing here a quote from to a couple of sociologists who said, for an individual male to enjoy the benefit derived from membership in the dominant gender group, really in the dominant sex group, he must be presenting himself as a man, which is a dramaturgical task, they say. To be credited as a man, what an individual male must do, it is put on a convincing manhood act, which requires mastering a set of conventional signifying practices through which the identity man is established and upheld in interaction. And some of my work will be building on that.
People slow down.
Slow down. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Slow down.
Slow down. Slow down.
Slow down. Okay. So, all right. So I need a bit more time. I speak fast in English and I speak fast in Italian. All right. Dominant older adult suicide theory. The dominant theory in English literature is that older adult suicide is a response to the adversities and losses of aging. And this is an example of a quote from a very well-known, long deceased suicidology Dublin, who said that it's a result of a response to chronic and peripheral diseases, loneliness, futility, and so on and so forth. This theory has survived over the decades, and you see references to it in more recent publication. Again, losses and adversities have been talked about and written about as the reason for older adult suicide. So another quote from Dublin is that it's not strange that some older people would wish to shake off the infirmities and boredom of an unsatisfactory existence through suicide. So almost naturalizing suicide for older adults. So what I'm going to do is in this presentation is really to bring context and culture in matters of suicide and focusing on older adult male suicide, focusing on the United States as a cultural case, in order to really ground our analysis on a specific place and a particular time. And I think it's very important to study the US as a culture because they tend to write as if the culture is absent for them, everybody else has a culture. It's not true. And so again, I will also focus very much on addressing this particular group that is mostly engaged in this set of patterns of high mortality by suicide, which is older adult white men, a group that tends not to be studied as a cultural group. So the first thing that I would like to remind you and highlight is that if indeed, as Dublin said, aging adversities and losses were the main causes of older adult suicide, then we would expect other groups to have higher rates, or every group to have higher rates, but certainly not white men, because men of European descent are less exposed, women and ethnic minority in the United States, for example, people of African descent, to the aging losses and adversity that are assumed to be significant in older adult suicide. What are these adversities that are often quoted? Ill health, disabilities. Fewer older men suffer from ill health relative to women, older women. Fewer are widowed, fewer are single, fewer live alone, fewer live in poverty. If you take the ethnicity lens, European Americans, women and men, have less exposure than ethnic minorities, and particularly African descent individual in the United States, to the adversity of aging that are assumed to be significant in terms of older adult suicide. And again, ill health and poverty are two examples. This is a cartoon that basically brings some irony to a category of analysis that has been brought through a book by Casey Stanton, The Death of Despair, which is the idea that there are, among men of European descent, there is high rates of suicide because they experience high rates of economic and social distress. They do, but they are not the group with the highest rates. And I can read you the cartoon later if you want to know what it says. So the other dominant theory in the field is that older adult suicide is a response to depression. But if you look at the data, first, older adults report more emotional well-being and stability than younger adults, and major depression is less prevalent among older adults than young adults. Also, older men have lower rates of depression than older women. In the United States, the data in terms of African descent versus European descent, older adults are also by sex are not very good. So it's not clear what the pattern says. So neither aging adversities nor depression explain older adult white men higher suicide rates. So now I bring theory that I think would help us make sense of those paradoxes, cultural script theory. And my point is that to understand US men's pattern of suicide by age, and specifically older adult white men, high mortality by suicide, we need to consider cultural factors. We need to attend to meanings of gender, age, aging, and suicide. And as I said before, a cultural perspective tends to be used to understand suicidal behavior in developing countries or among ethnic minorities, rarely applied to examine suicidal behavior among dominant group in industrialized society. And I think it's very important to do that. Because the failure to examine suicidal behavior in dominant groups from a cultural perspective implies that culture is something that others have as opposed to everybody. So what is the cultural script of suicidal behavior? In each culture, there are unique and specific conditions when suicidal behavior is relatively permissible and even expected. A suicide script features the scenario of the suicidal act, including the suicidal person, who that person is by sex or age or ethnicity, the method, the emotion and motives expressed or attributed to the suicidal individual, the precipitants of the suicidal act, the outcome of the suicidal act, fatal or non-fatal, and the response of others to the suicidal act. Suicide scripts organize and provide significance and influence the frequency and dynamics of individual suicides, with individuals in each culture drawing implicitly on these scripts in terms of choosing their own course of action and to give this action public significance. Engage in the self-destructive behavior, in this case, non-fatal, for example, versus fatal suicidal behavior, those behaviors that are prescribed for them within their culture. So the likelihood that someone responds to a life event or an adversity with suicidal behavior is related to the social meanings and the permissibility of suicidal behavior for that person in relation to that event. So what are some US dominant norms of suicide? One is that suicide is viewed as relatively more permissible, more understandable when it involves older adults. And this is one study that we did with respondents being European Americans who endorsed this particular belief. Second belief is that suicide in the United States is viewed as relatively more understandable, more permissible if it is a response to an illness or disability independent of the person's age. And again, there's data that supports this particular set of hypotheses. Whether or not physical illness is truly triggering suicide for European Americans, this belief may set up an expectation and a model we wrote. Individuals who are sick may see themselves or may be seen by others as experiencing a situation that calls for suicide. They may end up feeling or be made to feel by others that suicide could be a relatively reasonable moral way to respond to the difficulties. The third idea, important point in terms of understanding older adult white male suicide is that in the United States, suicide, and think about even the language, taking your life, or as it was called, completed suicide, successful suicide, is viewed as a male act. Male suicide is viewed as less wrong than female suicide, particularly if the person is an older adult, at which point it may even be viewed as rational. There are conditions in the United States in terms of this idea of the script when suicide is viewed as particularly masculine, which again is when it is response to an illness as opposed to other events, including interpersonal losses. By contrast, surviving a suicidal act, also called attempted suicide, is viewed as more feminine than, unquote, completed suicide, with males being more concerned about surviving a suicidal act because it's viewed as a feminine behavior. This is the United States. And as an example, I bring you this quote from a song by Frank Zappa, who said that if you're thinking that you don't want to live anymore, make sure you do it right the first time, because nothing is worse than the suicide jump. Suicide in the United States and in Europe is also be considered an act that requires a degree of energy, courage, and intelligence that was thought to be found, and this was colonial theory, only in white educated men. Other people were viewed as not capable of suicide because it means relinquishing deliberately life, which white men thought only white men could do because they had a higher moral standing. There are now two case studies, and I will go through them very quickly with just a few quotes. One is George Eastman, who died at age 77, and the other one is Hunter Thompson, both men of European descent, and he died at age 67 more recently. In terms of George Eastman, it's interesting to see how his death was narrated at the time. He was described as someone who died by his own hand as he lived his life, being in charge. So this was described as a powerful decision, and this was a suicide note. Even though there were indices that cues that he had lost a very close friend, and that might be a cause. Similar, the death of Bettelheim, who was a psychoanalyst, was described as a decision of a powerful man. He was described as a man who was a fighter, and that when he was sick, he decided to take his life, as a man would do. That by his own decision is the title of the obituary. So in many ways, you can see that Eastman's suicide is narrated in a very simplistic way. The suicide is viewed as mastery over the physical losses associated with aging, and the role of close relationship, loss of close relationship, which was there in the history of Eastman, was kind of overlooked or not paid attention to. The other case study is that of Hunter Thompson, who died more recently in 2005 at age 67, was a journalist. The press, when they wrote about his death, again, wrote that it had to do with the fact that he had health disability and that, unquote, he was not going to suffer the indignities of old age, which is exactly Dublin's language. So it came back many, many years later, this idea of the indignities of old age. Again, family and friends who were interviewed about Thompson's death said we knew that he was going to kill himself. He was going to go on his own terms and on his own time. He made this as a choice. It was like single courageous gunshot. Um, it actually came out later that he killed himself while he was on the phone with his wife, whereby the press changed the narrative and said, well, we thought he was a big hero and a courageous man, but his suicide was not, and they used the term pretty. The suicide was not pretty. Why? Because he killed himself while talking on the phone with his wife, and therefore the suicide was not honorable. And they wrote, "You're supposed to go out um, behind the woodshed, face the existential solitude, and let your survivor find you later." So you can see this idea of the script really coming visible through the way suicide is narrated in different venues, including in this case in the Rolling Stone magazine. So for the case of Thompson, I would say again that his suicide was narrated in a very simplistic way. In this case, there was this idea of mastery over the presumed indignity of aging, and no attention was paid to his ambivalence about taking his life, the fact that he was on the phone. There was some information that came out that maybe there was some ways that he was trying to engage with his wife, perhaps almost a plead for "keep me alive." But the response was not one of affirmation of life, possibly one of affirmation that we expect you to do this, given the what came up in the interviews. So the shared dominant stories of Thompson and Eastman is that their suicide was an act of courage, it was rational, it was decisive. And in both stories, information about psychological vulnerabilities and vulnerability emotions and close relationship was very much missing, although there were hints of those. In terms of dominant attitudes that are relevant, therefore, to older adult men's vulnerability to suicide, bringing all these pieces together, is that in the United States, there's a relatively permissive attitude about older adult suicide. There are relatively permissive attitudes towards suicide by a person who have illnesses or disabilities, and suicide is viewed as a masculine act. So this triad together, I think, creates this very dangerous combination in terms of older adult white male. Now, prevention, thinking about using a masculinity scripts lens to theory, research, clinical work, and the prevention of male suicide, taking a masculinity scripts and suicide scripts perspective on male suicide makes culture and specifically gender norms visible in suicide. It promotes awareness of the cultural specificity of US older adult white male suicide vulnerability. Is not about men in general, is not about men, older adults, and is not about whites in general. Is that intersection. Um, and then it challenges the assumption of the inevitability of the high suicide rates among males, including the high mortality by suicide of men, older adult men of European descent. And sometimes there is a sense of course they do it, and kind of lack of curiosity in some ways. Also, taking masculinist script stimulates attention to modifiable cultural risk and protective factors. For in terms of male suicide. The association, I don't know why it's going forward, association um, of masculinity and suicide in dominant European American culture makes suicide a relatively acceptable death for European American men, almost a moral death, a death of courage. This the social acceptance of suicide under condition of physical illness normalizes suicide among individuals with health problems and disabilities. Um, the masculinity and suicide script theories and evidence suggest direction for the prevention of men's suicide. They point to the potential role of challenging dominant scripts of masculinity. The US evidence highlights the dangers for men of the suicide as a masculine act script. It points to the importance of assessing beliefs about masculinity and suicide in suicide prevention programs. It also points to the importance of educating about and challenging the suicide as a masculine act script in communities where such script is endorsed. So programs aiming at preventing male suicide might include assessments of beliefs about the meaning and permissibility of different suicidal behaviors, fatal versus non-fatal suicidality, as well as education about potentially enabling suicide and masculinity scripts, such as the to be honorable, and men should do, as Frank Zappa said, suicide right the first time. So these are the references, and this is the end of the um, talk with my contact information there. In case you want to get in touch with me. I do the references.
Say, okay. Should we move? Right, shall we put our hands together one more time? So what we are going to do is that when you raise your hands, Charles is going to, or one of the national service personnel has come around. Charles is busily taking some pictures. One of you is very smart and cute. Yeah, you're very petite, very, very petite. Yeah. So please, we're recording. And so when you take it, don't be shaking it. We don't want this to fall. Just take it gently. You raise your hands. We don't want to take it. No, no, like, take it gently. Okay, so is there any hand? Then we'll bring it to any hand. Yeah, okay, it's a hand.
Thank you so much for the presentation, very in-depth. Going through along with you, one thing that strikes me, which I want to look at it from a cultural perspective of Ghanaians, pointing out that among the Europeans or the men, it says that suicide is considered rational, courageous, and decisive. Just was reflecting through how in Ghana, a male acts suicide will be considered as a rational thing, as a courageous and decisive choice. In our context, looking at the cultural perspective, is something that I think needs to be much delved into, bringing it to our context so we could reflect on it, knowing very well that not too long ago, suicide in Ghana was a crime. Now it has been decriminalized. But even that, you cannot in Ghana say that somebody who have died by suicide have made a rational, courageous, and decisive choice. And so I want us to elaborate a bit, bringing it to our context. Thank you.
Then, let's the second one.
I
So,
like
Prof.
let me one at a time, or I'll forget.
Okay.
So in terms of Ghana and any other place, I was very specific, and I want you to understand that what I'm presenting you is not a theory of everybody. I really wanted you to see it as a case study on the US and the US older adult white men of this generation, because I think things will evolve. The idea of script is really ideas, norms, expectations, attitudes that people have in a particular culture that are not fixed, and they are local in terms of culture, and they are specific across in terms of time. So this is what I'm inviting you to think about, is really to use the principle as opposed to the specifics. If you apply this particular kind of analysis to Ghana, what kind of things might emerge? Probably a different script, but And that's what you need in many ways to get some sense of and attend to. So the power of this is really to the method, not the specifics, not the features of the script. Like method is very specific in the United States. It's very different in different locations. Like the high use of firearms as a method of suicide is the US thing. Even Canada does not have that high rates among men. The rates of firearm suicide in the United States are higher among women than the rates of firearm suicide among men in Canada. So even two countries that sometimes people think they are similar, the firearms is a very US script. So that's the idea in terms of using this particular set of framework.
Maybe let's bring Johnny.
All right, thank you, Prof, for this great presentation. And let me also commend you for the works you have done in this area. But some of us, we had to rely extensively on your work before we could do our PhD on suicides or men in Ghana. Yeah, so currently we are also having the gender paradox in Ghana, where we have females reporting attempted suicides and mortality, suicide is normally high for males. But a pattern that I've seen through our research is that where we um, define suicide as male and female attempted suicide as feminine, we are likely to have underreporting of female suicides. They do happen. I had instances, but family members will never allow you to go and access that data. However, if the suicide is a male, it is easier for family members to open up. So it means that this gender paradox could also be read,
Yes.
as an artifact of maybe cultural, understandings of suicide. That is one. Interestingly, the area of older men suicide is something maybe we have not averted our attention to in Ghana. However, what is also happening in Ghana is that there are also older persons who are also taking their lives. And our research we did, recently also showed that the key issue had been one of burdensomeness, where older men feel there are burdens on their families, especially younger children, younger family members, because of chronic conditions or the other, or because there's an imminent shame. And for that reason, they will better die than to endure the shame. All right. So that is how the pattern looks like in Ghana. But I think, borrowing from what you have presented, maybe we need to probably disaggregate, our data and look at, the ethnic uh, dimensions of it and see whether we could also make such deductions like you have done. But I think this has been a brilliant, presentation you have made, and we shall learn a lot from that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So let me just comment. I agree with you on the gap in official rates of suicide between female and males. It likely is representing a miscount, an undercount of female suicide and an undercount of non-fatal suicidal behavior in men. There is some work that I've done and some work that has been done by others to indicate that in some countries, and I'm thinking about data from the United States, they found that deaths that are undetermined are more common among females because there is a different threshold almost that in the United States too they use to determine that for females that it would have been a suicide. And some of it is method that when you use poisoning, that may be more ambiguity and it may be viewed as an accident or a miscalculation. So I think that that the gap would be narrowed in many low-income countries. The gap is already narrowed. So I think that what we see in the United States is a very peculiar case in many ways, which is why I think we shouldn't really use the United States the model and the guide. It's like that is an exotic, original, singular set of circumstances. And if anything, the United States should really stand back and say, what's going on in most of the world. Most suicide occurs in low and middle income countries. That's where we need to start from. At the same time, there is also this issue of local scripts, local realities with different meanings, even within countries by all kinds of other dimensions. And again, as you were saying, in the United States, a dimension of social classification and which is something that determines your life in important ways. So I don't call it race because I think it's racist to call it race, but I call it ethnicity. But there is also a reality of racism associated with being classified on the basis of what you look like. That creates certain consequences. So I think that in the United States, therefore, I think it matters to look at by those categories that the census uses, and that determines your life. In your country, again, there is also a distribution of organization and communities that have identities in cultural uniqueness as related to ethnicity. And that, therefore, I think there are places also to really listen with a fresh mind to what the story is, because you can't just take the Ghana perspective.
With my friend was saying, you could see a certain romanticization of the suicides of these two men. You know, they were cast in more positive terms, the religious. I can assure you that you will never have this in Ghana.
Mm-hmm.
An older person will take his life, and then you have people romanticizing the no. Why? Because here in Ghana, in Africa, there is a social role for the older person. We
Mm-hmm.
call it in tree penin. It's a
Yes.
social role,
Yes.
and a lot is expected of that person.
Mm-hmm.
And you are the embodiment, the fountain of honor, knowledge, wisdom for the family.
Mm-hmm.
You are also the preserver of the family history. And therefore, you are a model. So no matter the challenge you may go through, society is not expecting you to take that route.
Yeah.
So you are likely to have family members underreporting such suicides because they will not let it come out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's also one cultural variation you can have, you know, should it happen in Ghana. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Thank you for the opportunity. Just to add to what Johnny Ando said, that even in cultures in Ghana, when one is found to have died by suicide, it becomes flag on the whole family. There are certain things that that family cannot enjoy by the virtue of the fact that somebody is done by that route in the family. Now, going through the presentation, especially when the journalist, who, what's the name of the journalist? Thompson. Ah, that he died whilst on phone with the wife. And then Joanne said that, oh, he could have done it by other way. He would have gone to the back. And then,
yes.
yes.
So, yes.
Then
Yes,
later
yes.
the relatives,
Then it should have been. Then it would have been a good suicide.
yes, before they find out. And then Eastman says that my work is done. Why wait?
Yes.
For me, I will want to look at that from culture perspective to see some cultural acceptance that
Totally. Yes. That's exactly my point. That those are cultural scripts. They are not even found outside of that generation of older adult white men. Although, if you look at some developments in the United States and in other parts of the world, you have seen a movement called the Right to Die movement, which has been arguing that people should have access to ways of hasten their death through physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia. And many of those legislative initiatives, which passed in Oregon and in New York and in Colorado, have names like death with dignity. So you see a particular mentality, which I think is this death of, by the way, are particularly common among whites. So older adult white women and men are most likely in the United States to accede to methods to hasten their death through taking a poison or having been euthanized. No other group is as kind of engaged in that particular set of unquote options. Canada is very, very moving very, very fast. They call it medical aid in dying. So it has been completely medicalized. It doesn't even sound like hastening your death. So I think that there is something within maybe the Protestant white culture that as a sense of that somehow getting older is associated with shame and lack of dignity, and to be a moral superior and dignified man and woman, that you should remove yourself through some means. The suicide is, as you were saying, is viewed as maybe not so great, but if you do it through the hospital who offers it to you as an aid, as a procedure, then it becomes in some ways normalized. And again, 5% of death now in Canada are deaths by what they call MAID, medical assistant in dying, mostly euthanasia, not actually physician-assisted suicide, which is even worse. Because if you have to do it yourself, then maybe you get the poison, but maybe set it aside. But if someone does it for you, it's done and it's final and it's done right away. So you see a particular script that is spreading out in United States and Canada and other countries, of this idea that if you're an older adult and if you have some disability, that it would be the death with dignity if you hasten it.
So I was looking at consistent effort to get a whole culture to accept that suicide is normal. It's okay. Because as Johnny Ando said, without any study, I can tell you on authority that for a Ghanaian to accept that it is a male act, no, it is never going to happen, because our culture is built in such a way that a man should be able to withstand anything, regardless. You should be able to withstand. So that statement alone, I'm thinking that it will be difficult in the Ghanaian context. So I was wondering how that culture came to accept the fact that suicide is a normal way of life.
I'm an observer of that culture. So I'm not from within, which in some ways gives me some insight and some curiosity and compassion, but I also don't really get it. Rates of suicide from my country in Italy are much lower, by the way, than in the United States. And but again, I think that each culture has its unique norms, its unique values. So this idea of the warrior, of the hero in the United States has also included among men of European descent this idea that if you are becoming more fragile and if you are becoming more dependent as a man, that the heroic thing to do, the moral thing to do, would be to take your life. And now with Death with Dignity, of the people who are dying, descendants of so-called with dignity, I have enough men, like 98% of European descent is called white. So it is a white thing in the United States, and it's half and half when it is with assistance by the medical care. So in some ways, you see also how gender norms play a role, where suicide is taking your life is viewed as a male act. But if someone takes your life, hastened it through the medical system, then women go to it. Although the percentage of women and men who die of physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, or both. Yes.
Yes. So I was just wondering if also increases the likelihood. You said that suicide is permissible when it's an older white and the illness, disability. I'm just thinking aloud that if there's a less lethal means,
Yes.
does it also increase the
Yes.
probability that you just, take some pills and sleep and then you're gone?
Yeah. So what I call the gender paradox, which is the higher engagement of females in suicidal behavior, but their lower mortality. And conversely, for males, the low rates of non-fatal suicidal behavior and high mortality is in some ways associated with the script that taking your life is a male act, that is more acceptable for a female to survive suicidal act, and also the kind of method that is part of that script. In the United States, as I said, firearms represents about 2/3 of the death by suicide of males, because they are much more immediately lethal firearms. There is less room in some ways for something else to happen except death. But it's in some ways it's this catch of the script that men are viewed as not honorable if they survive a suicidal act. So you see that within that particular script, men can't afford to engage or use a method that leaves room for survival, because that would be particularly shameful. So they, if you wish, they're more choosy, but they engage in acts that are more likely to be fatal, because that is viewed as the manly thing to do it. And the assumption by many others, not me, is that therefore men are less impulsive, or that they know how to do it and women are incompetent on how to kill themselves, or they are more deliberate and they mean it more. But there have been a number of cases of men who survived a suicidal act with a very potentially fatal mean. You might have heard of someone who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and survived. And he has gone around telling the story that once he was down, almost down, hitting the water, that he thought, and again, this is an analogy, but who knows what he thought exactly, but post factor, that all the things that he thought were unacceptable and unsolvable could be solved and he could live with. The only thing that he felt like he couldn't stop was this descent into likely death. And at that point, he put all of his energy, physical and mental, into trying to find ways to survive and scan the water to see whether there was a way for him to get to shore. So this idea that men's suicides are less impulsive because they are fatal is a misunderstanding. I think that men in many ways are cornered into a situation in which in the United States they can't allow themselves to survive it.
Yeah.
And they don't talk about it because it's not viewed as manly to say, I'm feeling not well, I've emotions and feelings and things that I'm experiencing that are painful, that are embarrassing, that I'm shameful, and that I can't stop ruminating over them. So oftentimes male suicide stories are written in such a way that it seems like a impulsive, strange, no, not impulsive, but strange act in the story of a person that up until that point was doing just fine. But mostly because the man may have given clues to others, but they were ambiguous, and others were not willing to recognize that pain, that suffering, that turmoil, because they couldn't really imagine that a man would be expressing those feelings.
Yeah.
So there is a miscommunication on both sides. Men might communicate pain that is physical as opposed to psychological. There are studies that have been conducted that men go and visit their physician prior to their death fairly often, within a month of their death. So there is a way to reach out that, however, may not be used to communicate directly the suicidal thoughts, and the physician does not inquire or perceive that within a psychological lens. So there are missed opportunities both ways that are part of the masculinity script in many ways.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Prof, for the presentation. So mine.
Last person, I will take one from A.
Okay. So mine is on the chart that you shared earlier. I think you shared it twice. And I noticed that indigenous,
Right,
yeah, those of indigenous descent,
right.
African descent, European
Descent.
descent. I noticed that the indigenous descent suicide used to be very high, but it dipped.
Well, it's high among the youth.
The youth,
And
okay,
it's low among people of indigenous descent. A very difficult life, socially, economically, culturally, huge history of oppression. So you see it in youth, a sense of alienation.
okay,
But you don't see, at least as an idiom of distress, suicide among older adults.
okay. So I noticed that. So I just want to find out about those from African descent, and I don't know if African descent means those from Africa that maybe migrate to the U.S.
I just want to find out whether maybe due to cultural assimilation, they will also end up committing suicide because it is permissible there, because of the permissive attitude about suicide in the US, because of the cultural culture in the US. And then secondly, I think I didn't hear anything about LGBTQ. I don't know if we have quite a number of older persons in that category that are also committing suicide. So thank you.
So I would like to acknowledge with you that the category of Africa, what I call African descent, it's my way to avoid using color terms, which I find problematic. And I'm happy for you to have a conversation with me and tell me what you think about it. But again, in terms of my sensibility as a European, that is a racist way to talk about people. But the problem, even with African descent, is that it makes into a single homogeneous group people of very different history and experiences in terms of even how long they've been in the States, in what state in the United States, and what kind of descents and cultural milieu they find themselves into. There are some people who have done work looking at nuances among that population, whether you're born in the United States, or how long you've been there, whether you have Caribbean origin, whether you recent migration from Africa, or in what part of Africa, and they found differences. And one thing that I remember, Joe is the person who has done that work. He's a social worker, and he used to be in Michigan. I don't remember where he's now, but he found, if I remember correctly, higher rates of non-fatal suicidal behavior among men of Caribbean descent, for example. So you see that the idioms of distress are not male, female, or African and not African. Again, the script really varies by within African descent, also from what region you come from, and the script of suicide is in that region. Another example is that people tend to use the method of their country of immigration in the first generation when they're just immigrant. So if you are from Asia, you will tend to use, and you just immigrated, the methods that are more common in Asia. And then the next generation, you become, unquote, acculturated to the method in the United States. So you see the cultural script very much active in this set of nuances of method and of kind of suicidal behavior, including among European descent. So I think that two pieces in terms of the lower rates of mortality among African descent men and women. One piece may be this idea that I've kind of read about and I thought might make sense, that in many ways the African American experience is one of fighting for survival and trying to, against all odds in some ways, to defy the neglect and abuse. So in many ways, suicide may be viewed as part of giving away defeat and giving what people in some way want you. They don't want you to survive and succeed. So I see that as possibly a protective factor and a form of affirmation. There may also be the issue of undercounting that has come up before, whereby those maybe that for a variety of different reasons are recorded as something else. Probably both. There's some evidence that maybe the death by suicide in African American dominant communities might be undercounted.
I think we're going to get into Dr. Andrade as the last question. So,
Theories propounded for the explanation of the inner paradox, in suicidal behavior, is the issue of the differential rates depression, where they claim that females suffer depression, more than males and all that. Since so far, more than 10 years, doing male suicide research, I'm beginning to interrogate that particular claim. Is it the case that men don't suffer depression that much? Or it's an artifact of, again, measurement and assessment? What is your opinion on that?
I am with you. I think that, again, if you think in terms of scripts and idioms of distress, that depression in the United States and in other similarly related similar cultures is viewed as a female way to express discontent, suffering. If you look at the symptoms in the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, Statistical Manual of Disorders, like crying or expressing feeling of vulnerability, those are ways of communicating distress that are in many ways socialized as female. So I think that if you think about depression as a particular condition and experience, that the way you express it will likely vary depending on what's considered feminine or masculine as a depression. So I think that there is quite a bit of the literature that has talked about male depression as taking often different forms, that it might come as symptoms, irritability, substance or alcohol abuse might be part of that phenomenology, because some of the conventional and more commonly recognized signs of depression are not considered masculine. So there too, in many ways, if you think about the high rates of substance abuse in males, might be that capturing a particular state of mind that is coded in under drug abuse, but in many ways the experience probably is an experience of depression that is that however phenomenology, in terms of phenomenology, because there is substance abuse, it's called substance abuse alone, but underneath is probably something similar, and vice versa, that people tend to underdiagnose females in terms of substance abuse, because often substance abuse in females is with prescribed or legal stuff, and more hidden, so it tends to be under-recognized because there's more stigma for females to abuse substances, especially illegal substances. So I think that those rates, again, represent the result also of a script.
Okay. Last question is online. This is from Grace Coleman. Jeblet. He says, from your perspective, what is one practical step the elderly can take to help create a culture where people feel safe talking about suicide and seeking support? From your perspective.
Well, I'm thinking that as a collectively, we need to kind of be curious about the scripts and collectively interrogate them and thinking about what they implicitly prescribe to us, what we internalize through them, and therefore challenge them and with irony as well as with force when we are exposed to scripts as older adults or young adults that are really destructive. So I see the burden on all of us to look at what is going on in terms of older adults or young adults, and really looking at this social norm, this cultural script, as something that is there, that it may be naturalized, normalized, but it's not inevitable. It's something that is can evolve, and we can leverage some good parts of it, like the stigma against suicide for females is something that we can leave in place. We need to add that piece of it to for males, not to glorify or inadvertently elevate male suicide as a courageous act, as you could see from the writing about male suicide, what male suicide that was done in several venues. I give you some example, like the song by Frank Zappa, "You Better Do It Right the First Time." Those are things that seem inconsequential, but again, with all kinds of other pieces in the culture you're exposed to, they kind of become part of your mindset, your mind, and they work on us. So I think we are responsible collectively to kind of pay attention to all those pieces in the culture that can poison our behavior in ways that is not just an individual choice. And we can therefore then kind of move forward together and kind of say that is something that certainly we're exposed to, but let's do something different. So it kind of a collective psychotherapy, writing a different script.
Shall I put your hands together one more time? All right. So, on behalf of the managing committee, members here, two of them, Dr. Kusia Admai. No, can we see your hand? Right. Shall I put your hands together for her? And then Dr. Delali Novi. Shall I put your hands together for her? All right. We also have our administrator, Rachel Manti here. Mama View, right? And then we have our research assistant here, Ama, Srifi Ama. Ama is both a student and is, and then all of you who are students here, one round up. Oh, I have one of my PhD students who has completed waiting to defend. Uh, Irene Bobkin. Shall we welcome her? Yeah. Irene, what to see you. To see you. Yeah. Waiting to defend. Yeah. And interestingly, Irene also worked on suicide. So I'm not surprised she's here. Um, so on behalf of all of them, um, Sylvia, I want to say thank you very much. Sylvia has been very passionate about getting this thing done. And so when she came, she's been traveling, but she will call and find out, is it coming on? I'll be arriving on this date, blah, blah, blah. Today we have had it. And we are very proud of you. Interestingly, this year is the 10th anniversary of the Center for Aging Studies. And this is the first seminar we have had in a year. Yeah. And so a number of interesting seminars are coming up. Some of the seminars very soon, all the students will announce to you. You will know the program outline for the year. Some of them will bring older persons, maybe two of them here, and then we engage them. We want to hear your thoughts on a number of issues. They will speak if they can speak English, why not? We'll begin from the university. Maybe we get someone like Vice Common Vice Chancellor and London lady. They will sit and then you engage. So exciting programs are coming up in 2026. It's our 10th anniversary. So the students who are joining us this year, you are special because they're going to be really enjoying a very interesting time. For some time now, our programs have been streaming online. So you can go online and watch again. I like this presentation because it gives us ideas into some of the areas of our research in aging. We haven't done much in this area, and the center is hoping that our PhD students will delve into so many areas. And so go back and play it again over and over and see whether this will lead you into an area of interest that you could, for example, organize your PhD thesis topic around. On that note, I want to thank you very much. Another seminar is in the offering. We will tell you maybe some 3 weeks' time. So the date and the flyer will come out. And for all the PhD students, especially the PhD students year 2 and year 1 and the MPhil, please never ever miss seminars. Seminars are very key to your training and to your experience and networking and building knowledge, all of that. So thank you very much. And God bless all of you. Have a good weekend. Bye bye. And shall we also thank our media team? You know, I just called them. I called them just this afternoon. And where's Brembe? Maybe it's out, eh? All right. So hope just pray for us. Maybe by in the middle of the year. Yeah, we'll be taking a picture. So we'll be taking a picture right on the staircase so that we have our own system at the back. Then somebody is fixing for us. So thank you very much, our auntie and Johnny Anna. God bless you. So online, thank you very much for joining. We are proud of you and the question that came. Join us. This Center for Aging Studies, no size.